Pull a loaf of pumpernickel off the shelf at almost any American grocery store, turn it over, and read the very first ingredient. It will not say rye. It will say enriched wheat flour. Read a little further, and you find something stranger. There is more water in that loaf than there is rye, and that deep near-black colour you have always associated with pumpernickel, the colour of wet earth and dark chocolate, was not earned in any oven. It was poured in from a bottle of caramel colouring. Some brands reach for cocoa instead. Others use instant coffee or a slug of molasses. The package says pumpernickel. What is actually inside is a wheat loaf in a costume. The real thing uses 3 ingredients: cracked rye, water, and a little salt. There is no wheat flour anywhere in it, and not a single drop of dye. It is baked for up to 24 hours. It survives for months without one preservative, and it produces one of the lowest blood sugar responses of any bread science has ever measured. You have eaten authentic pumpernickel. At least that is what you were told, because the loaf medieval Germans actually baked shares almost nothing with the one on your shelf, starting with a name that was never meant as a compliment. It was the middle of the 15th century, and in the towns of Westphalia, in the northwest of what is now Germany, a dark and astonishingly heavy loaf was already showing up in written records. By 1450, it had a place in print. By the time the word we know was written down, around the year 1663, that loaf had a reputation. And the reputation was not flattering. Pumpernickel is not a gentle word. Strip it down to its German roots and you get something no marketing team would invent today. The first half, pumpern, was Old German for breaking wind. It was an onomatopoeia, a word built to sound like the thing it described. Say it slowly and you will hear it. The second half, nickel, was a nickname for a goblin or a devil, the same root that gives English the phrase Old Nick for the devil, and even the name of the metal nickel, which old miners blamed on mischievous spirits in the rock. Put the two halves together, and the plainest reading is exactly as crude as it sounds. Pumpernickel means something close to the devil's fart. It was a joke about the bread's weight, its heavy fibre, and the very real effect a dense rye loaf had on the medieval digestive system. An even older German name for it was Krankbrot, which translates literally to sick bread. This was not a loaf anyone bragged about. It was coarse, it was filling, and it was what you ate when finer grain was not on the table. The trail of the word points straight back to Westphalia, with some scholars pinning the origin to the town of Osnabrück. The name travelled. It spread across Europe during the 30 Years' War, the brutal conflict that tore through the continent between 1618 and 1648, carried in the coarse vocabulary of the soldiers who lived on the stuff. By the time the fighting ended, most of Central Europe lay in ruins, but the word pumpernickel had gone everywhere the armies did. Now, if you have heard a different origin story, the version you have heard is probably not the full picture. There is a popular tale that Napoleon named the bread. The legend says he tasted it, declared it fit only for his horse, a horse supposedly named Nickel, and grumbled that it was bon pour nickel, good for nickel. It is a charming story. It is also completely false. The word pumpernickel was already in print roughly a century and a half before Napoleon was born. Folklorists who actually traced it, including a sweeping survey done back in 1954, put its origin squarely in Westphalia and squarely in that blunt German root. The French horse never existed. We just like tidy origin stories better than honest ones. So here is the situation we have inherited. A bread so humble that its own name mocked the people eating it is now sold back to us at a premium and called artisan. And the cheap version on the shelf does not even bother to be the real bread. It fakes the colour and keeps the name. The same coarse, stubborn grain that earned this loaf an insulting name was the exact thing that made it nearly impossible to ruin. Traditional Westphalian pumpernickel is one of the simplest foods in the entire European canon. You take whole rye kernels, the intact grain, and crack them coarsely. You add water. You add a little salt, and usually a portion of rye sourdough the bakery has kept alive for years. That is the whole formula. There is no wheat flour in it. There are no seeds, no oil, no sugar, no colouring, and no chemistry. A 15th century peasant could not have found within walking distance of his own field. Now compare that to what gets sold under the same name. Pick up a typical American deli pumpernickel and the ingredient list runs long. Enriched wheat flour comes first, which means wheat is the main event. Then water. Then somewhere down the list, rye meal, in a smaller quantity than the water. After that you tend to find wheat gluten, soybean oil, cocoa processed with alkali, ground caraway, a preservative like calcium propionate, lactic acid to fake a sourdough tang, and caramel colour to supply the darkness the oven never produced. There is more water in that loaf than there is rye. The single ingredient the bread is named after shows up in a smaller amount than plain tap water. People assume the dark colour and the word rye on the bag mean they are buying rye bread. They are wrong. The American style is typically around 2/3 wheat flour and 1/3 rye, leavened with ordinary commercial yeast to save time, then darkened with additives because the fast bake never builds the colour on its own. And here is the part that still does not quite add up. There is a tell you can spot from across the room. Caraway seeds. Real Westphalian pumpernickel does not contain a single one. The seeded swirled loaf in the deli case is an American invention, a different bread that simply borrowed a German name. If you see caraway, you are not looking at pumpernickel as Westphalia understands it. You are looking at a cousin in disguise. Rye, for what it is worth, became the grain of Northern Europe for a hard reason. The sandy, acidic soils of the North German plain could not support much wheat, but rye thrived in cold, poor ground where other grains gave up. It was the grain of the poor precisely because it grew where nothing better would. And that humble, hardy grain carried properties the people growing it could feel but never explain. Inside the oven is where this bread stopped being simple. Traditional pumpernickel is not really baked in the way we use that word. It is sealed into a lidded pan, slid into a low oven at around 250 degrees Fahrenheit, and left alone for 16 to 24 hours. Some bakeries run even lower, close to the boiling point of water, in a chamber thick with steam. At that temperature, nothing browns the way a normal crust browns. The loaf barely forms a crust at all. What happens instead is slow, and it happens all the way through. Over those long hours, two things transform the dough. The natural sugars locked inside the rye begin to caramelize, and the sugars and amino acids react together in what chemists call the Maillard reaction, the same process that darkens a seared steak or a roasted coffee bean. Run for most of a day inside a sealed pan, that reaction turns the entire loaf brown to black, top to bottom, and pulls a deep sweetness out of a dough that contains no added sugar at all. The colour and the sweetness are not poured in. They are built slowly out of the grain itself. Sit with that contrast for a second. The medieval loaf earns its colour over the better part of a day through chemistry happening inside the grain. The modern imitation gets the same colour in seconds from a bottle because it never spends the time. One is a process, the other is a paint job, because so little crust forms the finished loaf is sliced wafer thin, almost like a dense cake, which is exactly how Germans still serve it today. Calling the whole thing baking is almost generous. It is closer to a day-long steam. The long, slow sourdough does more than flavour the bread. The wild bacteria in a rye starter produce lactic and acetic acid as they work, dropping the dough into an acidity where mould and spoilage organisms simply cannot get a foothold. That acidity, combined with how tightly rye holds onto water, is why a properly made loaf survives for months in a cool cellar with no refrigeration and no preservatives, just grain, acid, and time. And if the story stopped at a loaf that builds its own colour, sweetens itself without sugar, and refuses to spoil for half a year, that would already be a quiet humiliation for the version on your shelf. It does not stop there. One quick thing before the part that matters most. If you have ever handed over $8 or $9 for a loaf labelled artisan rye, carried it home, and only later realised you bought wheat flour and food colouring, this channel exists to keep that from happening to you again. Subscribe to Medieval Way and you will stop overpaying for costume bread. Now, here is the detail the marketing departments wished you never connected. While the modern bread industry was busy chasing speed, softness, and a long life on the shelf, the chemistry packed inside that dense black loaf was doing something to the bodies of the people eating it. And what it was doing turns the whole hierarchy of bread upside down. Pumpernickel has one of the lowest glycemic indexes of any bread ever tested. The glycemic index is just a measure of how fast a food drives up your blood sugar, with white bread sitting near the top of the scale as the benchmark. Most pumpernickel lands somewhere around 41 to 56 on that scale, and the densest whole kernel versions sit right at the bottom of that range. The clearest demonstration came from a study published in 1986 in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. Researchers fed measured portions of different wheat and rye products to diabetic volunteers and tracked how their blood sugar responded. Set white bread at 100. Wholemeal wheat bread came in at 96, barely an improvement. Wholemeal rye scored 89. Pumpernickel dropped to 78. But the lowest score of the entire test, a 48, belonged to intact whole rye kernels, the grain left in big, barely broken pieces. The lesson is almost crude in its simplicity. The less you grind the grain, the slower it hits your blood. That is exactly why the fraud is more than a matter of taste. The fake pumpernickel, built on finely milled wheat flour, does the opposite of the real thing. Fine flour is digested fast and spikes blood sugar quickly. The dense, coarse whole kernel loaf resists digestion at almost every step. The reason comes down to structure and a thing called resistant starch. In a real pumpernickel, the rye stays in large pieces your digestive enzymes struggle to break apart, so the starch is released slowly instead of all at once. The researchers who studied this proposed a simple mechanism. The compact, barely broken loaf survives digestion in large chunks, and those big particles are far harder for your gut to get at than the fine paste a slice of white bread becomes. Dark rye breads can carry up to 8 times the resistant starch of a standard wheat loaf. Most people never heard about this part, because the bread that proves it best is the one we replaced with a softer, faster, dyed imitation. The benefits do not end at blood sugar. In one trial, men who ate rye bread daily for 4 weeks saw measurable drops in their total and LDL cholesterol. To be straight with you, the women in that same study did not see a significant change, and that honest result matters more than a clean headline. But the direction is clear, and it lines up with everything else we know about coarse whole grains and fibre. So here is the verdict, weighed and dated. A bread medieval Germans nicknamed the devil's fart, that an even older name called sick bread turns out by the numbers to be one of the healthiest loaves a person can eat. The peasants choking down dark rye through a long northern winter were eating something a modern nutritionist would prescribe for blood sugar control. A loaf named after flatulence beats the entire bakery aisle on blood sugar. So, not the marketing department's finest hour. The bread the language mocked was quietly superior the whole time, and the costume version sitting in the bread aisle hands you a fast wheat spike under a coat of caramel paint. For most of the last century, All of this stayed locked inside a handful of old Westphalian bakeries and a few stubborn German brands. That is finally starting to change, and you do not need a medieval guild to take part. There are two things you can do with all of this, and the first one costs you nothing. Next time you are buying so-called pumpernickel, turn the bag over before it goes in your cart. The first ingredient should be whole rye or rye meal, not wheat flour. There should be no caramel colour on the list. And if you want the true Westphalian style, there should be no caraway seeds. If wheat flour leads the list and the colour came from a bottle, put it back. You are being sold a name, not a bread. The second thing is to bake the real loaf yourself, which is easier than its reputation suggests. You need 3 ingredients: coarsely cracked whole rye berries, sometimes sold as rye chops, plus water and a pinch of salt. If you keep a rye sourdough starter, a spoonful will speed things along. If you do not, the wild bacteria already living on the grain and in the air will start the work on their own, just more slowly. Soak the cracked rye in hot water overnight so the kernels soften and begin to swell. The next day, let it ferment, anywhere from 12 to 24 hours, until it smells tangy and alive. That overnight soak and long ferment are not fussy extras. The soak softens the hard kernels, and the ferment is where the sourdough acid develops, the same acid that will later help the loaf keep for months. Then pack the heavy dough tightly into a loaf pan with a tight lid, pressing out the air gaps, because the trapped steam is going to do most of the cooking. Start it in the oven around 300 degrees Fahrenheit for the first 45 minutes to bring the inside up to temperature. Then drop the heat to roughly 220 and leave it, lid closed, for 16 to 24 hours. Do not open it. The moisture sealed inside is the entire point. What comes out will be almost black, dense enough to slice paper thin, and sweet without a grain of added sugar. Wrapped in cloth and kept somewhere cool and dark, it will last for months. 3 ingredients, 1 long sleep in a low oven, and a loaf that beats anything on the shelf on flavour, on shelf life, and on what it does to your blood sugar. So next time you are standing in the bread aisle and you spot that dark loaf with pumpernickel printed across the front, pick it up and turn it over. If the first word is wheat and the colour came out of a bottle, you are not holding pumpernickel. You are holding a 500-year-old name stretched over a wheat loaf and dyed to match. The real thing was never fancy. It was rye, water, salt, and a baker patient enough to wait a full day. A bread the language once mocked, that outlasts, outflavours, and outperforms the version we replaced it with. If this is the kind of buried, infuriating detail you want more of, subscribe to Medieval Way. Every week we dig up the food and the survival knowledge that someone, somewhere, decided was not worth keeping.